everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. In the last lesson, we talked about three notes sounding simultaneously and forming the triad. But today we're going to talk about four notes sounding simultaneously and forming what we call a seventh chord. Remember, we compared the triad to a snowman that had three balls of snow stacked one above another. In the seventh chord, it's the same procedure. You have the snowman, but the snowman is taller. It has the fourth ball of snow at the top. So in the triad, in the root position triad, the intervals above the root were the third and the fifth. In the seventh chord, we're going to have another interval. We're going to have the third, just like in the triad, the fifth, also just like in the triad, and then we're going to have the seventh above the root. And remember, with the triads, we built a triad on every single degree of the scale. We're not going to do that with the seventh chord. We're going to make things a little bit easier for us, and we're only going to build the seventh chord today on the fifth degree of the scale. So let's go to our C major scale. And let's review some of the knowledge that we gained in the last lesson. Let's build a root position triad on the first degree of the scale. What that means is that we are going to use the first degree, which is the C, as the root for our root position triad. In the root position triad, we need the interval of the third and of the fifth. So we're going to start on C, then we're going to build a third up, which is E, and a fifth up from the root, which is G. We have three notes, C, E, G, and this is our triad on the first degree of the C major scale. And you have learned in the last lesson how to label this chord. The root is the first degree, and for that reason, we are going to use the Roman 1 to label this chord. So if you were to tell me what kind of a chord this is, if you were to label it or identify it, you could say this is a C major triad in root position, or you could say this is chord 1 in root position in C major. And now let's try to build a seventh chord on the fifth degree of that scale. So the fifth degree of C major is C, D, E, F, G. It's G. So we're going to build this seventh chord starting on G, and G is going to be our root. We need a third. Third above G is B. We need a fifth. Fifth above G is D. And we need a seventh. And a seventh above G is F. So we have four notes, G, B, D, F, that form our seventh chord. And we're going to label it. What is the root of this chord? Easy, it is G, and G is the fifth degree. So we're going to use the Roman 5 in order to label this chord. So if I asked you to identify what kind of a chord is it, you would say, well, this is the seventh chord in root position on the fifth degree of C major scale. So it is chord 5 in C major. Let's try to see what the difference is between chord 1 and chord 5. Of course, chord 1 is made of different notes. So chord 1 is going to sound lower than chord 5. And of course, chord 5 has got an extra note on top of it. But these are not the most important differences. The crucial difference lies in the fact that chord 1 is only made of the intervals that are consonant of the third and the fifth. They are consonances, and they're not ordinary consonances. They are the most stable ones. They occur very early on in the harmonic series. While in the seventh chord, in chord 5, we not only have the third and the fifth, we also have the seventh, which is not a consonant. It is a dissonance. What that means is that whenever chord 5 comes up in music, and whenever it is a seventh chord that comes up in music, it is going to create tension in that piece of music. It is going to create a sense of anxiety, and anything that will follow after this chord, you will know that has to somehow bring a resolution to the tension that was created by the seventh chord in the first place. So the seventh chord on the fifth degree and the triad on the first degree have a very special relationship, because the chord that is going to resolve the tension created by the seventh chord on the fifth degree is chord 1. This is going to be the chord that is going to resolve that tension the best. So that is the reason why usually in a piece of music, if you come to a climactic point, this is usually where chord 5 occurs, and it is usually a seventh chord. And by the end of the piece, in order to mark that it's finishing and that it's resolving, you are going to have chord 1. And the special relationship between chord 5 and chord 1 is illustrated in how we call these two chords. So chord 5 has a special name, and that name is the dominant. And the chord 1 has the name the tonic. So you could say chord 5 and chord 1, but you could also say the dominant and the tonic. And now let's go to inversions of chord 5 and of chord 1. In the last lesson, you have already learned how to invert the triad. So you know that we have the root position, the first inversion, and the second inversion. But we are today going to learn how to label these inversions, how to let our reader know that a given chord is not a root position chord, but an inversion. Let's take a look at a C major triad at our chord 1. So we're going to label it with the Roman 1 underneath. And this is important. On the right side of the Roman number, we're going to put the intervals that this triad is made of. So we're going to put the Roman 1, and then on the right side, we're going to write 3 and 5, because it's the interval of the third and of the fifth above the root that make up this triad. Let's go to the first inversion of this chord. It's still chord 1 because it was built on the first degree of the C major scale. So C is the root, but the root is no longer the lowest note. So what we're going to do is we're still going to put the Roman 1 because it's still chord 1, but the intervals have changed. The intervals are now the third and the sixth. So next to the Roman 1, we're going to write 3 and 6. And now in the second inversion, it's still chord 1, so we're putting the Roman 1, and on the right side, we're going to write 4 and 6, because it's the fourth and the sixth above the lowest note that make up this triad. This is how you label the triad in root position in the first inversion and in the second inversion. And now let's go to the 7th chord, or chord 5 on the 5th degree of C major, and let's see how inversions look in the 7th chord. So in the 7th chord we have not 3 notes but 4 notes, so that means that we're going to have the root position, the first inversion, second inversion, and the third inversion. Let's start with the root position. We have G, B, D, and F. We're going to label it with the Roman 5, and on the right side of the Roman 5 we're going to put the intervals, which are 3, 5, and 7. Now we're going to move that lowest note, G, to the top of the chord, and now we're going to have B, D, F, G. And we're going to label it 5. It's still the same chord, but the intervals have changed. We're going to write next to the Roman 5, we're going to write the intervals, which are 3, 5, and 6, because it's the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th above the lowest note that make up this chord. Now let's go to the second inversion. In our second inversion, we're going to move that B to the top of the chord, and now the lowest note of this chord is going to be D. So we have D, F, G, and B. How are we going to label it? Still, it's chord 5, so we're writing the Roman 5, and now next to the Roman 5, we're going to write the intervals that make up this chord. From D to F, it is the 3rd. From D to G, it is the 4th. And from D to B, it is the 6th. So we're going to write next to the Roman 5, 3, 4, and 6. And now in the last inversion, in the 3rd inversion, our lowest note is going to be F. And the intervals above this lowest note are the 2nd, the 4th, and the 6th. So we're going to label it writing a Roman 5, it's still chord 5, and now next to the Roman 5 we're going to write 2, 4, and 6. So this is how you label the root position and the inversions of the triad, and this is how you label the root position and the inversions of the 7th chord. In this lesson, you have learned only about the 7th chord built on the 5th degree, because chord 5, the 7th chord on the 5th degree, the dominant, is the most important 7th chord. But of course, you could build 7th chords on other degrees of the scale. And one of my favorite 7th chords that is not on the 5th degree of the scale is the 7th chord on the 7th degree of a minor harmonic scale. In a minor harmonic scale, as you remember from the last lesson, the 7th degree is raised. So if we are in A minor instead of G, we would have G sharp as our 7th degree. And if you build a 7th chord on that G sharp, you will end up having G sharp, B, D, and F. And while the intervals above the root are 3, 5, and 7, just like in any other 7th chord, if you look at the interval that is between G sharp and B, and then the one between B and D, and then the one between D and F, you will see that all of these small intervals are minor thirds. I think it is an interesting chord, and it does a lot of exciting things in pieces of music, and this is why it is one of my favorite chords. This is it for today's lesson on the 7th chord and on its inversions. You have learned how to build a 7th chord. You have learned that the most important 7th chord is on the 5th degree of the scale. You have learned how to call this chord, that it's called the dominant, and you have learned that the chord on the 1st degree is called the tonic. You have learned that the relationship between the dominant and the tonic is a very important one for any musical structure. And finally, you have learned how to label the root position and inversions of both the triad and of a 7th chord. Well done, congratulations. Don't forget to move on to the next sections of the lesson, and see you soon in the next one.